And are you letting people in, Kayla?
Yes, I am. People are beginning to join right now.
Okay.
WIIS gave me a wonderful network and a sense of community. Without WIIS's support and inspiration, I would never have had the career that I've been able to have in national security.
WIIS is the premier organization in the world dedicated to advancing the leadership and professional development of women in the field of international peace and security.
WIIS is such an important organization because it not only amplifies the voices of women working on security issues, but it also fosters the relationships for those women to speak for themselves.
Joining WIIS is helpful for one's career because it opens spaces for different and at times challenging opinions.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Chantal Oudraat. I'm the president of Women in International Security, also known as WIIS. Welcome to today's event. This event is part of our Gender and Security Policy Roundtable series. And the aim of this series is really to highlight the gender dimensions of important national and international security challenges. And I would like to recognize and thank Liechtenstein, and in particular its ambassador in Washington, DC, Ambassador Kurt Jäger, and his team, notably Matt Keller, for the support and the partnerships over the years for these roundtables. Now, today's roundtable is devoted to gender and arms control. And today we're also presenting a policy brief on the issue, which can be found in the chat. In this brief, I and my colleague Jana Wattenberg review the literature on this topic and present a framework on how to approach the issue of gender in the arms control and disarmament field. This year, we actually have a number of important events related to the arms control and disarmament agenda. First of all, earlier this year, in January, we saw the entry into force of the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. In August, we will have the NPT review conference, which will then be followed by the Conference of States Parties of the Arms Trade Treaty. We have a review conference of the Biological Weapons Convention. And of course, we have issues related to the revival of the Iran nuclear deal. We still have a North Korea dossier. issues related to the modernization of existing arsenals, and the issue of new weapons, particularly in the cyber realm. So in sum, we have actually a very busy and important agenda when we're talking about arms control and disarmament. Now, before I introduce our fabulous panel for today, I would like to hand over the screen to Ambassador Kurt Jäger, the ambassador of Liechtenstein, to say a few words. Ambassador Jäger.
Thank you, Chantal. Good day. I say good day to everybody, depending on where you are. I'd once again like to thank you, Chantal, and your team at WIIS for putting together this event on gender and arms control, especially the group of distinguished panelists we have with us today discuss an incredibly relevant topic. And as you say, this discussion comes ahead of numerous important dates for the multilateral arms control agenda. The importance of arms control and disarmament is obvious. While states with weapons have reduced their arsenal in recent, together these 9 states still have a total of 13,000 nuclear warheads. And 2,000 of these nuclear warheads are kept in a state of high operational alert, ready to strike. And world military spending stood at almost 2 trillion in 2020, an increase of 2.6% from the year before, and according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the highest number since 1988, when the CPRI started tracking these expenditures. A report released earlier this month by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, estimates that the total expenses on nuclear weapons alone stood at 72.6 billion in 2020, which was an increase of 1.4 billion from the previous year. The report also shows how a small number of companies profit from the nuclear weapons contracts, mostly the known names like Northrop Grumman and General Dynamics and Lockheed Martin. In sum, the level of means of destruction and amounts of money spent on weapons are not decreasing. Arms control and disarmament should be a high priority for all of us. And I've read with great interest the policy brief that was prepared by Chantal and Jana Wattenberg. And as Chantal and Jana point out, in the last 2 decades, policymakers have in fact paid greater attention to gender, we have to admit, including in arms control and disarmament. That said, a lot of this attention is focused on participation. And this is understandable because participation is easy to comprehend and easy to measure. But as Chantal and Jana also point out, participation is only the beginning and one facet of the gender and arms control issue. The policy brief points to further areas such as the importance of analyzing the disproportionate ways in which male and females suffer from different types of weapons, as well as how unequal power hierarchies and one-sided notions of gender baked into arms control disarmament agreements perpetuate inequalities and gender biases. It highlights the fact that it is civil society organizations that are the main drivers of bringing attention to including gender provisions in arms controls agreements, which will be essential in concluding agreements that are truly human-centric rather than state-centric. It also points out that it is essential to fully consider gender perspectives and how gender language is used in the disclosure on arms control and disarmament, and how that has contributed to negative practices, detaching many from the consequences of nuclear war, while also marginalizing certain groups of people. And correcting this will be critical in order to enhance strategies and the success in reducing arms. The policy brief also points to a number of concrete initiatives that policymakers should take and research researchers should pursue. Gender audits of arms control and disarmament organizations would be obvious, the first steps, and I'm interested to hear how likely this is to happen. Another important initiative would be to figure out how we can quasi-retrofit existing arms control agreements with gender provisions and how that can increase the effectiveness of the agreements. So I look forward to the discussion. I'm sure the fact that each one of the panelists approaches the issue from a very different perspective will very much enrich the discussion. In that regard, I think this event and the panel is a good illustration of the objectives of these roundtables, that is to raise the awareness and increase knowledge about gender dimensions of security problems, and second, to bridge divides between gender and the WPS community on the one hand and the traditional security community on the other, and to open dialogues between these different communities. And with this, I also want to express a personal note of thank you for your time you spent with us here in Washington. I wish you all the best for the future, Chantal.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jaeger. As you said, we have indeed a fabulous panel, and they all come at this issue from very different positions and different perspectives. I will briefly introduce our panelists, but you will find full bios in the chat. First of all, we have Rae Acheson. She is Director of Reaching Critical Will, the disarmament program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, probably the oldest women's organization active in the peace and security field, and in particular in the disarmament field. Rae has been a very active participant of ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, a campaign that I recall received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. And Rae is also the author of a recent book called Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy, in which she chronicles and examines the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Deepti Chubey is an old friend and supporter of WIIS, former executive member of the executive board. Deepti is currently the Director of Knowledge Management and Human Resource Services at the CTBTO in Vienna, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization. And she took up this post only, I think, 2 months ago. Prior to her current position, she was head of public affairs at the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW in The Hague. And before her multilateral arms control career, Deepti has worked as an analyst in the United States in many different US think tanks, including the Nuclear Threat Initiative, the Carnegie Endowment, and Johns Hopkins University. Renata Hesman-Dalacqua is the program lead for the Gender and Disarmament program at UNIDIR, the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, a program that I must say, Renata, has really flourished under your direction. You have really, I think, single-handedly put gender and disarmament on the map, particularly within the UN context. You're the author of numerous influential reports on gender and arms control. And again, I refer all of you to the chat where you can find links. And then last, but certainly not least, my colleague, Jana Wattenberg. Jana is a lecturer in international politics and security at Aberystwyth University in the UK and was a 2019 WIIS Next Generation Fellow. So that is our panel, and the way we would like to proceed is as follows. First, I would like to ask Jana to briefly introduce our policy brief, and thanks to Kurt Jaeger, some of the points that we make in the brief have already been put on the table. Second, after Jana's brief introduction of our brief, I will engage in a discussion with our panelists for about 30-40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions for our audience. So Jana, briefly, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chantal. I like how you very casually brought the word briefly in multiple times to remind me that I really have to be brief when I present a report. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this fantastic panel, and thank you so much to the WIIS team for organizing this great event. Now I'm going to, as Chantal said, briefly introduce key themes from our policy report. If any of you who are listening today, or if any of you who are going to watch the recording have any further questions after the event or during the event, post it in the chat, or after the event, you can always get in touch with us. We are really looking forward to hearing all your thoughts and our ideas. So our policy report had two main aims, as was already pointed out earlier. Firstly, Chantal and I tried to take stock of the literature, debate, and initiatives that are out there on gender and arms control and disarmament. And secondly, and kind of more importantly, we wanted to provide practitioners with a gender framework that they could use when they think about and pursue arms control and disarmament policies. Now, our gender framework is based on 3 Ps: participation, provisions, and perspectives. Now, thinking about gender in terms of participation encourages us to think about the question, what is the constitution of the groups who are negotiating and deciding upon arms control and disarmament policies? And crucially, who is missing in these discussions? Now, what we have observed was the emergence of very interesting research on the underrepresentation of some groups in the arms control and disarmament community. So Chantal already mentioned some of UNIDIR's reports, and I'm sure Renata has some great insights on those to share. But some of these reports tell us basically that women as one group that is working on these issues women are significantly underrepresented. Now, in recent years, we have seen the emergence of multiple initiatives that try to address this problem. So Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy is a good example, but there are also multiple women in nuclear non-proliferation and women in non-proliferation initiatives that all seek to somehow increase gender diversity in the arms control and disarmament field. Now, it's important to note when we think about participation that women have not merely been missing, but they have actually played really important roles in multiple disarmament movements, for instance, in the nuclear disarmament movement. And I'm sure Ray could share some great insights about the roles of women in the Ban the Bond movement with us later. Now, Chantal and I point out in our report that while these initiatives are great first steps, it is really important that we now monitor the progress that has been achieved by these initiatives in order to ensure sustainable increasement of gender diversity in the field. It would also be important to move beyond the inclusion of different gender groups to also think about the inclusion of other marginalized communities, which might be disproportionately impacted by the production or use of various classes of weapons. Now, as the ambassador has already pointed out, a key point of our brief is that gender can mean more than, quote unquote, adding more women. It can also mean using gender perspectives when we think about arms control and disarmament proposals. Now, gender perspectives are obviously a very heterogeneous field of research. And in our brief, we highlight 3 particular contributions that these perspectives can make to our thinking about arms control and disarmament. Firstly, a gender lens can help practitioners to reflect on the ways in which notions of femininity and masculinity might shape the ways in which they assign value to weapons and the ways in which they view proposals to get rid of these weapons. Secondly, gender analysis can help us to understand how hierarchical power structures in the arms control and disarmament community are built up and maintained. Here, the role of gender discourses in maintaining social hierarchies is particularly important. Lastly, gender perspectives really encourage us to reconceptualize how we think about security, with the key contribution being shifting from national security lenses to more human security lenses. These perspectives also encourage us to think more critically about who are important agents in world politics. Now, the last of the P's, provisions, gives practitioners practical suggestions to account for the gendered impact of weapons use and production in arms control and disarmament agreements. Together, these 3 Ps give practitioners 3 entry points to pay more attention to gender when they think about and develop arms control and disarmament proposals. Participation encourages us to really think about who the groups are that have the ability to shape arms control and disarmament proposals. Perspectives help us to advance the way in which we think about the value of weapons, the ways in which we value particular proposals to either upgrade or disarm arsenals, and really encourage us as well to shift the way in which we conceptualize security. Lastly, provisions offer ways to account for the gendered harm that weapons have on multiple different groups and to account for the gender dimension of weapons use in arms control and disarmament agreements. Now, since Chantal reminded me to be brief, I'm going to stop here and give Chantal a quick chance to come in case I accidentally forgot something really important. And I'd like to thank you all so much for listening. Back to you, Chantal.
Thank you, Jana. So let's start a discussion here with our panelists. And I would like to ask a question to all 3 of you, and that is, why is it so important for us to integrate gender in arms control and disarmament debates and agreements. And from your vantage point, which of those 3 Ps that we're talking about in our framework is the most important, and why? And maybe Deepti, let me start with you. And I know participation is a big issue for you. And maybe you can give us some sort of very concrete examples from your recent experiences. Deepti.
Thank you so much. And Chantal and Jana, I also want to offer my congratulations on this important contribution to the dialogue that we all need to continue to be having. And also, Chantal, I do want to just a short shout out to you for your tireless leadership in terms of promoting women at all stages in their career. I have seen it firsthand. It means so much. And I think actually the whole field really owes you a debt of gratitude. That said, thank you for including me. My career is a bit interesting in that I have been in the private sector. I've been in the nuclear weapons policy space. And I think it actually prepared me well to then be kind of in the belly of the so-called beast in terms of part of a technical secretariat for the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And then now as part of a provisional technical secretariat. And when I was listening to kind of the definition of participation about what is how is it constituted in terms of who's negotiating the terms, there's part of that for me where I'm like, but wait, there's this piece about implementation. And as much as, yes, governments are key players and the delegations that are part of these multilateral organizations are key, the people who are the staff members of international organizations are equally important. And that's because the actual decisions taken by our states parties, as well as our rules and regulations, they don't easily dictate every single issue that happens. So there's a lot of debate and interpretation that happens about the implementation of policies that come from the people who staff a secretariat. In terms of which of these 3 things I think is most important, I would argue that I actually think all 3 entry points are necessary. The one that I can kind of speak, particularly from recent experience, most strongly about is around participation. I have been in roles where I'm the only woman in the room, and I'm sure that's not a strange experience for many of you, but I've also seen the impact that has. And I'll just give you this scenario where we're dealing with a crisis situation, things that you would have seen in the news, and we're having these conversations. I'm the only woman, and yet I felt like part of what I needed to do was to try to ask questions to come back to first principles about what was the objective of the conversation. What are we trying to do? What are we trying to recommend? That would enrich the conversation. It would lead to a different set of next steps. And then when I would exit the meeting, people would come up to me and saying, oh, I'm so glad that you raised that. And my response to them was, yes, I can raise it, but why didn't you? And what I've realized is that when there isn't diversity in terms of just even gender, let's put aside other kinds of diversity, there's a certain kind of falling into lockstep that happens during these kinds of conversations, that people aren't willing to ask those questions. Now, I don't think it's necessarily anything that's endemic to being a woman versus a man, but I do think there's something that we look to each other to find that space that we can raise real issues. So I give that to you as one small example. But the other thing I would say, particularly coming from a discipline which is around leadership by example, if you don't see the change, it's really hard to get the cultural aspects of how people work together to align with a vision of more inclusiveness. So for me, at least, I feel really lucky to finally be in a position where I can really exemplify that change and implement policies to try to bring on board more diversity, both in terms of gender as well as people from other parts of the world. I will just end there as my initial intervention, but I wanted to share those perspectives.
Thank you, Deepti. Renata, how does this look from your vantage point? You've done a lot of research and actually provided some data in terms of representation and participation. Renata?
Thanks, Chantal, and thank you, colleagues from WIIS, for inviting me and including me in this conversation. It's a pleasure to join you. And I just want to say before I begin that I work for the UN Institute on Disarmament Research, but I'm speaking here on my personal capacity. And as the program leader of a program called Gender and Disarmament, a lot of the times I have to answer this question, right? Why gender and disarmament? And sometimes the question is even more direct than that. It's like, why should I care? Why is this important in arms control and disarmament? So it's not the first time I've been asked, why is this important? So I already have a few things that I always like to bring up when I'm confronted with this question. There are many reasons and many arguments I could use to exemplify why this conversation is important. I think the first one on the issues of participation, it's a matter of fairness and equality. And yes, you should care even if it's not about you. It's a recognition that women as well as men have the right to participate and shape the outcomes of decisions and also to implement the policies, as Dipti was saying. So this, I think, it's the very straightforward reason why this is important. Another one that is more tailored to this field, right? It's like, actually, gender provisions, they matter. They can have an impact in people's lives. So if you include gender considerations in arms control measures, for instance, the link between, when you address the link between the availability of small arms and gender-based violence, be it via the ATT or national legislation that deny guns license to those convicted of domestic violence, intimidation, or stalking, this has the potential to actually change the lives, have a positive impact on the lives of people on the ground. Gender provisions in arms control, for instance, for gender sensitive assistance, as you have for the CCM, the Cluster Munition Convention, or the APNDC, the Landmine Convention Action Plan, and also the TPNW, the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This can also, improve the life of people on the ground. Provisions for age and gender sensitive risk education that can also make risk education more effective. Other types of measures that have been integrated into action plans and follow-ups to treaties, for instance, collecting data, gender disaggregated data about beneficiaries, about survivors, about negotiators. All of this can make women visible and allow us to move away from men as the default, and again, enhance the effectiveness of policies. And this I'm talking from the point of view of the individuals on the ground, but from the point of view of the state, this can also maximize the use of resources. If you start to bring up your concerns with gender equality together in synergy with your concerns for prevention of violence with arms control, this can have the potential to increase synergy, maximize efforts, and lead to more effective results. So, and then my third argument that I would like to bring up is that a lot of the times we hear people saying, at least like, let's say, disarmament diplomats sometimes will tell you, oh, it's difficult to mobilize the public around this topic. Arms control and disarmament is not high on the public perception, it's not high in the public agenda, it's not like climate change, it's hard to mobilize people. But I believe gender equality issues are very much high on the public agenda. And if you want to increase visibility and bring the public on board to issues related to arms control and disarmament, that's actually a very, could be a very useful entry point. So this is kind of a more instrumental argument. You see, Chantal, I have to mobilize a whole arsenal of arguments in this job. And to conclude the second part of your question, which of the three pillars is the most important and why? I think all are important. And at UNIDIR, we work to generate knowledge, data, and analysis to support participation, to support gender provisions, to support gender perspectives. And we do this work, let's say, in the background. It's very much civil society and the national delegations that are bringing it forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Renata. Ray, let me turn to you. And I would like to ask you to particularly maybe address the issue of gender perspectives, how notions of gender really shape and inform our arms control policies?
Yeah, I can't answer a question like this without talking about that. So,
Yes.
and I totally agree with everything that Deepti and Renata have said. So I'm really glad that we're all covering different aspects of this. And I think, I agree with them too, that they're all related. Participation, for example, diversity and participation will lead to stronger provisions and stronger perspectives, but on its own is insufficient. And so that's why I wanted to highlight the importance of gender perspectives. And I also want to start out by saying that for WILP, gender is really related to intersectional feminism. So when we talk about gender, it's not a binary of men and women, it's about sex, gender identity, sexual orientation. It's also race, ethnicity, class, ability, geography, etc. And this is really important because people experience the world differently and experience oppressions differently across a number of identities. And accounting for this means developing policies and approaches that work for more people. So we can't just treat this as, women as a monolithic group or men as a monolithic group either, and really need to be inclusive in our understanding of gender. So applying a gender perspective and taking this kind of intersectional feminist approach to disarmament gives you several crucial things. It helps understand how people can be differentially or disproportionately impacted by specific weapons or by conflict and violence. And it gives you also key insights about gender norms that are really imperative to understanding weapons proliferation and possession and use, and basically to understand why it is that our world is so militarized. Without a gender analysis, it's really easy to miss how norms around masculinity are based on ideas of violence equaling strength or weapons equaling power. And this is a really important part of the discourse that has been left out of the mainstream conversation at the UN and elsewhere for far too long. But we've inherited, all of us together have inherited a patriarchal system in which international relations and domestic budgets are organized around the idea that strength and security can best be secured through violence. And Ambassador Yeager mentioned the ICANN report on nuclear weapons spending earlier, and it's so important to see that even in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, these 9 nuclear armed states are still spending billions and billions of dollars on their nuclear weapon. Feminism helps us unpack this for what it is, and it opens up space to consider what we actually need in order to achieve peace and equality and justice and safety for the most people possible. That also includes looking at what's normative and how to change that. So what's expected of people based on certain categorizations. If you're a man, you're supposed to act a certain way or think a certain thing, etc. And people get boxed into these very binary categorizations and expectations about behavior and philosophy and approach to the world. And this affects what's considered credible or expert in international discourse. So when we're at the UN having these conversations, who's actually being listened to and who's having their eyes rolled, who's getting laughed at or being ignored, and whose opinions are being counted as really important and being a real stakeholder. So that's why it's not just about bringing people to the table, creating a more diverse new table altogether, or changing what a table even means or looks like, challenging fundamental assertions about why things are the way they are, who benefits currently from the way things are, and what alternative structures and systems could give us and what we need to build them.
Great, fantastic. I would like to remind our audience that you can pose your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Let me turn it over to Jana.
Thank you so much, Chantal. This is definitely one of the most fun events for me because I can switch between different roles and now have the pleasure to ask the next question. I would like to ask all the panelists if you could tell us a bit about what you think the key obstacles have been to have a more sustainable integration of gender in its multiple forms that we've discussed, in arms control and disarmament negotiations, communities, agreements. So maybe if you could identify 2 key obstacles that you would like to address or that you think stand in the way of a more sustainable acknowledgement of gender in arms control and disarmament, that'd be great. And if you'd like to, you could maybe even account for factors such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Did that have any impact on your view, or did it not change anything? So this is the next question. And I'm going to turn the order around, and I give it back to Ray first, and then we'll go to Renata and Dipti. Thank you.
Thanks, Jana. Well, I mean, I think I can start where I left off with my last remarks, which is basically that patriarchy is the key obstacle to sustainable integration of gender into disarmament and arms control. It's a persistent structure that we all live within. And when I talk about patriarchy, I don't mean, you know, monolithic men as a group being oppressive, but what I mean is the expectations that I was talking about, the gendered norms of what's acceptable and what's credible. And the discourse has been set and dominated principally by men. That's an undeniable truth. And in particular, white heteronormative cisgendered men from the global north. That is the group that within the UN and other intergovernmental meetings really dominates the discussion still on disarmament and arms control. And the work on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, of course, upset that. And we had a completely different process, which I'm happy to talk about later. But I think that, you know, when we're talking about the diversifying the participation in the very eloquent way that Dipti did, including through UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and other gender mainstreaming initiatives, that has helped to change the dynamics a little bit, as well as relentless advocacy from civil society, including groups like WILP, who always show up at meetings and bring it up and are annoying and persistent. But that's the thing, we're seen as annoying, right? We're seen as, oh, it's WILP, they're coming again, they're gonna make us think about gender. And it's interesting the reaction that you get. And you have several governments that are getting more and more into this as an agenda item, and that's been really great to see, but much more is needed because it's still mostly about numbers and not about the perspectives and the provisions, or about changing the way fundamentally that things work, which is what we need to do. WILP's Peace Women program did an analysis on 20 years of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And one of the things that it found was that militarism continues to be a persistent barrier to the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Yet conflict prevention, disarmament, and demilitarization are starkly absent from discussions on WPS. So this is really important, right? When we're looking at the connections between our agendas, and when we're looking at the obstacles our goals, we need to really think deeply and critically about how the entire system operates, not just the disarmament and arms control forums, but also how we're interacting with other forums, and where the changes need to be made on quite a fundamental level. And in terms of COVID-19, I mean, the pandemic's made all conversations harder, more accessible because they're online, but so much of the UN's work on disarmament and arms control has been postponed. Some have gone forward in really creative online ways. Others, like the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the work on autonomous weapons, is basically shut down during this period. So it's been as hard as ever to raise gender in these contexts, but also the pandemic really offers us an opportunity to reinforce how important it is to include gender perspectives and provisions in our work, right? Because we can all see the ways in which COVID-19 has horrifically compounding and reinforcing gendered impacts across the world in every society. And so there's, I think more people are waking up to this and realizing the importance of including it in multiple strands of work. And so I hope this is something that we can carry forward from here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ray. I particularly like your point on the importance of gender perspectives and how they fundamentally challenge so many of these additional pillars that a lot of our practices are based on. So they're so hard to actually bring forward. Thank you. Okay, Renata, you are up next, please.
Thank you, Jana. You asked this question about the 2 main obstacles. So I don't know, because my brain works in a different way, because I thought, what are the two enablers of arms control, of bringing gender into arms control and disarmament, and what kind of obstacles we face there. And I would say that among the factors that have been leading us to where we are now, where we see this tendency of greater integration, or at least, more awareness about the importance of gender perspectives in arms control and disarmament, I would say civil society participation is among the top factors, because it's always civil society that has been bringing this up. And availability of data and analysis, because we see when there is credible, reputable research, member states pick up on that and they bring it up in their interventions. And I think the TPNW is an example of that. There was a lot of, in the humanitarian initiative leading to the negotiations, you could see the discussions were very much informed by research. There were many presentations about gendered impacts of nuclear weapons, and I think that was very important to frame the clause in the TPNW that mandates for gender-sensitive assistance. And civil society was very much included in that process. And you also ended up with a report that acknowledges, the contribution of men and women in the preamble, and that that is a first for a nuclear weapons treaty. So I would say that limitations around civil society participation are an obstacle for this agenda, because I think this agenda is stronger when you have stronger civil society participation. And I think COVID has made this a bigger problem as well, has limited opportunities for civil society to interact and to follow some of the discussions, really. And the other issue on availability of gender and disaggregated data and analysis, I think you can see, my impression is that certain instruments, let's say around armed violence, where you have more data about gendered impacts, or nuclear weapons now that you have lots of data on gendered impacts, that makes it easier to integrate gender provisions in further instruments. I think where you don't have anything, the conversation can become a little bit abstract and or hypothetical, or so I see very much the value of civil society's participation and of generating relevant data and analysis around these issues.
Thanks so much, Renata. Excellent point.
Jana, if I may just Renata, I think, I wonder if you could talk also a little bit about how COVID has impacted the negotiations. Ray was mentioning this already, but I think you actually have some real data here as well.
Sure, it's more, on the issue of participation, I think there are less women diplomats taking the floor. Because a lot of the times now in the virtual negotiating room, you have to register in advance one speaker, and then usually the delegation registers the ambassador. And we know women are even more underrepresented at leadership levels. So in COVID now, we are seeing less women taking the floor in virtual interventions. And this is on the issue of participation, right? Women are even more absent from the conversation. And on the issue of taking forward the gender agenda, this is very much a personal impression, that there is less ambition in the room, in the virtual room. It's such a struggle to take the multilateral agenda forward in this format. It has required so much of innovation, creativity, setting up systems, making sure you have interpretation available, trying to avoid Zoom fatigue. There are so many factors that play in that a lot of the times the conversation becomes more restricted to the basics, or to what has a financial implication, or just the level of ambition for creating new initiatives and moving forward, let's say, joint statements on gender, more focused discussions on these issues that sometimes are not seen as the core business of arms control and disarmament. My personal impression is that there is less room for that in the pandemic setting, which I think also is a bit understandable. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge that has come up.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, Jana.
No, that's absolutely fine. I'm glad you intervened. That was such an interesting point. Thank you, Renata. Dipti, would you like to share your views on the second question with us, please?
Sure. In terms of two obstacles, let me give you two categories of obstacles. One is perceptions and the other is practical. So in terms of perceptions, I think there's an issue around where participation, where women are appointed to certain roles or inhabit them. We have to be careful that it doesn't get seen as token representation. And that happens definitely in the conversation around some of these appointments. And I noticed that there was a question around this in the chat, where how do we also not immediately ascribe to women that they necessarily hold certain views on these issues? So I think we need a little bit more complexity there. The other part of kind of the perceptions challenge is, I think when we think about that, the majority of decision makers, both within international organizations or government delegations, are generally men. How do we make sure that they don't see this gender discussion as being zero sum? That the advancement of women necessarily comes at the expense of men. And I think we're a bit challenged where I had to just recently deliver a report about how we're doing at CTBTO in terms of the appointment of women to particularly professional level posts. So we're starting to see numbers there where a third of our professional staff are women, but there's more to it than that, right? We don't want it just to be about numbers. And so for me, it's like, what is the framing of this that makes the discussion about Pareto optimal outcomes, that we all win when there's greater diversity? And one of the things I've been thinking about, particularly because I have an expanded set of responsibilities around knowledge management for the organization, it ties to an issue around organizational resilience. For me, I think there needs to be a framework around those of us who are international civil servants. We have a responsibility to our joint mission. Who are any of us to take steps that put that mission at risk? And I would argue not having top talent across genders as well as across the globe is something that puts our mission at risk. And I'm hoping that that reframing might create more space for people to understand the importance of gender and other aspects of diversity. In terms of the practical, and here I'll also touch on COVID, absolutely. I think one of the, it's clear from the research that women have been disproportionately impacted. And I think that is more than doubly true for women from developing countries. And what I feel is oftentimes neglected in the conversation about the representation of women, particularly from underrepresented geographical regions, there isn't really a full conversation about are conditions in place to enable the full mobility of women, particularly to take up leadership positions at higher levels. And I'll just paint for you a picture of something that was shared with me, where we had made an offer to somebody from an underrepresented region. And it was in the UN system, it's a professional level position, kind of mid-career. And it went to the point of the offer, and this person basically didn't have the full support of her family to be able to make the move to Vienna. How do we make it easier for women to actually make use of the opportunities in front of them, particularly when they come, they have maybe other things in terms of their domestic conditions or responsibilities? And here's where I think potentially COVID-19's impacts could be an opportunity, which is what is the future of work? And where can we have perhaps flexible work arrangements that would enable certain posts or positions to be done maybe mostly remotely, but that there would be opportunities for that person to integrate with headquarters or whatever is the key kind of team unit a few times a year or in the right way. And the other thing I'll just say about COVID and all this remote working and Zoom fatigue, the reality is that everybody has been improvising since last year. And nobody, neither managers nor staff members have been provided, or people who, chairs of multilateral forums, nobody has been provided with the training about how do we use this format? How do we prevent that kind of fatigue? How do we make sure we're still driving towards meaningful outcomes and not the de minimis outcome? So I think that if we ever are to go towards more flexible work arrangements, we really need to evaluate all of that and make sure people are really up to speed on how to engage this kind of, in order to engage this kind of format. So yeah, that's what I would just share. I think there's the opportunity for some meaningful changes, but it'll also probably take time, and I don't think it's going to happen overnight.
Thank you, Deepti. Yeah, you're asking a bigger question that relates to all fields and not just the arms control and disarmament field, and that's the future of work and how we can turn this crisis into a real opportunity. Yes.
Yeah. And sorry, Chantal, if I can just, there's one last thing I wanted to say. I'm sure some of you have seen in the media the discussion about the Great Quit, where in the coming weeks and quarter that it is expected that more workers will leave their jobs than at any time before in human history, and that it's one of the impacts of COVID as people have thought about what is meaningful to them, or they want to do something, not the job that they had, but want to do something else different. I will tell you that I am hoping to take great advantage of the Great Quit. So for any of you who are thinking about, applying your tremendous talents and skills to a meaningful mission like the one of the CTPTO, please look at our jobs page, please apply. But I'm really hoping that we can encourage women who have, I think, not felt supported in the last year plus to really see that there is opportunity for them, but I think we need to help them and support them and advocate for these opportunities so they can connect to them.
Okay, great. I think your call has been heard, Deepti. Let me, before we go to the audience, let me ask all of you sort of briefly, if you had a magic wand, what would be your top 2 or 3 priorities that you would like to see either in the policy domain or in terms of research? Or you could see, one of our audience members, Michael Brown, is asking, what specific actions would you like to see the Biden administration take in terms of the gender and arms control and disarmament agenda? Let me start with Renata.
Thanks, Chantal. This is not something particular to the Biden administration, but if I had a magic wand, what I would like to see more is efforts to build gender expertise within national delegations and within international regimes. So let's say more delegations attending arms control and disarmament, bringing a gender expert with them, or a secretariat hiring gender expert to ensure that efforts related to gender disaggregated data collection and analysis, are being taken up seriously and provide support for member states in this area. So I think these are very practical things that I would like to see, and I think that would be very constructive for the future. And then a broader goal I would have is a new understanding of arms control and disarmament, a bit more ambitious than what we have seen so far. I think it would be interesting to conceptualize arms control and disarmament in a way that goes direct to the point of, using these instruments to combat gender-based violence and femicides, and also ensuring they have provisions to support victims and survivors, to hold perpetrators to account, to enhance women's participation, and to build resilience to conflict. That is a more comprehensive understanding of arms control and disarmament than what we have today. But I think that's the direction that I would like to see us move towards too.
Ray, what's on your wish list?
Many things.
I'm sure.
But yeah, I think some of my priorities would be moving beyond the binary. This isn't an issue just about women's participation, but having a truly intersectional approach to diversity. And ensuring then that it's not just about ticking a box about what bodies are in the room. Getting people into the room is an important step, but that's insufficient for actually changing the dynamics in the way that we need to change them. And you know, the things that I said earlier about the dominant framework persisting because the same ways of thinking still dominate and people feel they have to fit into that framework in order to be taken seriously. So shifting all of that is so important. And I'd like to highlight the humanitarian initiative and the process for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as an ideal sort of launching point, I think, for future initiatives. Certainly not a perfect process, but actually took concrete steps towards enhancing participation, particularly from young women diplomats from the Global South. Ireland set up a sponsorship fund to make sure that participation was diverse as possible in meetings in both Geneva and New York. And that was, I think, a really great example that we can build upon, as was the collaboration with civil society that Renata mentioned. And we certainly had, you know, not just Northern-based NGOs participating, but also survivors were at the forefront of the work, and survivors of nuclear weapon use and testing and production from many countries around the world. And so I think those types of collaborations are very important for creating this alternative narrative, for shifting the dynamic in terms of credibility and seriousness about alternative perspectives. So we need a lot more of that, actively creating spaces and fostering diverse participation in order to build space for different narratives to be treated as credible, and then even guiding the work. And I think for both delegations and civil society, I think another important thing that we need to focus on is what space we're making for having the challenging conversations about alternative thinking to hegemonic discourse, what we're doing at the delegate level or at the NGO level to reflect the lived realities of people that are outside of our capitals, our delegations, you know, the usual work that we're doing at the UN. And who are we accountable to when we're making policy recommendations? Who are we getting funding from, and how does that implicate our policy positions? These are really hard questions that I think that a lot of organizations need to take up alongside governments. Thanks.
Thank you, Ray. Deepti?
If I had a magic wand, I guess the first thing I would come at this with is recognizing we're at the beginning of the third decade of this millennium. And I find some of the conversations that we still have to have as women to talk about how capable we are exhausting. I never thought I would be in my mid-40s and we still have these conversations. So if there was one thing that I would use that magic wand for, it is just simply to get rid of this idea that women aren't just as capable as anyone else. Because yeah, I find it tiring, and I'm sure that's the case for everybody who has certainly come before me and everyone else to come. The second thing I would try to use that magic wand for is to actually really make work a safe place for women and actually all people to bring their whole selves. So Ray, I so hear you about the intersectionality aspect of this, and also to bring the best of themselves. And what I fear is part of what's holding that back is we don't have full cultures of accountability. So I think that's the last thing I would use the wand for, is to make sure that we actually really are living up to what we state are our values and our standards, but that there's accountability for it. So those would be the few things that I would try to change with that wand, in the hopes that we could get farther faster.
Thank you. Jana, what audience questions do we have?
We have a lot of fantastic audience questions. Thank you all so much for your great insights so far. I'd like to start with one, which I think, Renata, you mentioned something that could be useful for this question earlier. Julia Erbel from the Permanent Mission of Austria asked us, can you give specific examples of how the lack of gender perspectives had a negative impact on women and girls? maybe I would just encourage the panelists to raise their hand if they would like to go first. And then we can just see who would like to speak to this question.
And maybe a few others, Jana.
Oh, a few others as well,
Yeah.
already. Okay. Okay, then I take the question from Natalie Silberman as well, who is policy advisor to the at the Swiss MOD. She asked how to incorporate gender into future arms control and disarmament frameworks, what challenges to take into account. I think this might be a good way to think very specifically and practically about concrete steps that practitioners could take. And then we have another question from Lena Victoria Dewing, who asks, are there any specific ethical, philosophical advantages to involve more women in arms control processes? This is a bit of a controversial question, I think, considering what we've said so far. So yeah, if the panelists could just choose, or I would propose the panelists can choose which question they would like to address, and then maybe you raise your hand and I can give you the floor accordingly. Renata, please go first. Thank you.
I was trying to find a virtual hand and I remember I have a real hand. So about the question of problems caused by lack of gender perspectives. I mean, we cannot know all kinds of issues that have been brought by the lack of something, but we can certainly point to a few ideas that have been let's say prevalent in this field that shows lack of diversity. So at our study at Unity, we did this study called Still Behind the Curve, where we looked at issues of participation, who was in the room when arms control and disarmament agreements are being negotiated. But beyond the quantitative analysis, we actually organized these focus groups with diplomats to get their sense of what is missing, what are we missing, what is the issue. Put these numbers in context. As we've been saying, it's not about only just a numbers game. It's more than that. And what we heard, so we interviewed around 60 participants, 50%, 40% men, 60% women, coming from all regions of the globe. And it was kind of sometimes difficult conversations, as Ray said, like there is not very much a tradition in this field of talking about these issues. So sometimes it was, the first time that the person was being asked to think about this and to think about issues related to gender inequalities and how they translate into arms control and disarmament. And what we learn is that there is this perception of who makes a good diplomat and who makes good diplomacy and who makes good policy in arms control and disarmament. And the ideas are usually about a man. So I think this can alienate diversity. It can prevent innovation from happening. And as Deepti said, it means we're not actually reaching out to the best individuals out there if we are excluding 50% of the population. So this was something that we heard in the conversations, that there is very much an idea of masculinities underpinning who makes good policy in this field. And what else? And then the other thing is, a lot of the times, not only in participation, but these weapons, they get used in the real world, and they get their impact is felt by not only combatants, but a lot of the time civilians as well. And civilians are a more diverse group than the group they have in mind when thinking about the battlefield, So there is this idea that who is the combatant is a man in a certain age, but the group that actually is impacted by these weapons are civilians, and that's very diverse. And you have, in diversity in terms of age, in diversity in terms of access to resources, diversity in terms of gender. And the fact that we are not considering this into the design of policies or into the design of response measures or the design of assistance measures, we are actually being blind to whole groups of population and the measures we are putting in place are not effectively addressing the needs of these groups. So I think the lack of gender perspectives ends up driving us to this world where it's the default man as the policymaker, as the combatant. And I think once you start to think about the reality on the ground and the reality that surrounds you, which is much more diverse than these concepts, you get to have more nuanced perspectives and correspondingly more adequate policy responses.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Renata. Would any of the other panelists like to come in on some of the questions as well? Yes, Dipti, I think you were a bit quicker than Ray, so I take Dipti and then Ray. You were nearly the same time.
Thanks. Mine's actually a really quick intervention on the second question that was asked about what else can be done to bring gender into the discussion around arms control. And I think we haven't directly addressed it, but I think it's the importance of allyship, where this cannot be an issue that is only voiced by women and acted on by women. So actually also to make this a little bit more conversational, we have an ally in this conversation with Ambassador Yeager. So I don't know if he would be interested in maybe sharing his own experience about trying to advance these issues. I, frankly, being in the multilateral context, I think it's extremely powerful every time allies like him are actually able to stand up and call for these issues. So I just wanted to say that and see if you would be willing to share any perspectives.
I mean, general front, the gender issue, I'm relatively optimistic, or have made good experiences over the past 5 years now in DC. I've seen that there's a lot more involvement, but it's really a dribbling effect. It's not it's a big bang things you're experiencing. I mean, for example, joining, like I will now when I'm in Geneva, there's a kind of a gender alliance where there's sponsorships of men and women, and then you commit to not taking part in any events if there's not at least a balanced gender representation on panel discussions. Well, the one today is that's a little bit of the problem. We don't get many men sometimes to speak out on these issues. On the non-proliferation and arms treaty, of course, we have no army. We're not involved in the part. I don't circulate in these fora that much. But I honestly, listening to what I heard today, we also have to just bear in mind that the true drivers in moving these things is probably going to be domestically. As long as leadership, the decision makers on arms issues in arms countries, the nuclear arms vested countries, are primarily men, it will be very difficult to change the dialogue and the agenda. I mean, so I've seen the US, there are quite, high positions in the Defense Department now with women, and that helps. As long as they're not there, it's very difficult to change the attitude. And I'm saying, again, you can have all these nuclear powers around the table, and they might be listening to NGOs and other people, but at the end, the ones who are going to make the decision whether they're going to change a treaty or not are those contracting parties. And if the leaders there don't domestically feel this push from their constituency, from their democratic institutions to change something, it's going to be very difficult. I mean, that's what is a little bit the pessimistic thing I have. We of course, it's important that we multilaterally we repeatedly inform people of what needs to be done and so on, but in the end, you have to reach the domestic political decision makers and in these superpowers, and if they don't move, it's going to be very difficult to change the outcome of these negotiations. That's my more pessimistic note on this. So this is not going to. So just DG said she's disappointed that nothing has really happened at first at the beginning of the third decade. And this field, non-proliferation and arms treaty, I mean, I honestly 20 years ago didn't expect that much to be happening in 20 years. Unfortunately, that is reality. I've become, in my age, more realistic. But I have to also, let's think back 30, 40 years ago where we stood on these issues. It was zero. I mean, there was no discussion about this, and it is happening today. In other areas, there's more progress than on this issue, which is military. That's always a very difficult subject matter. But I mean, others we talked about in WIIS, you know, on terrorism and security issues in general. I feel there's been movement, and I'm also seeing this in the WIIS context. I mean, the number of very competent speakers I've met now, thanks to WIIS, is impressive. I would not have known them otherwise. These fora are important, and on my level, I really try to push people in my administration to listen into these events, because they have this bias. They think, oh, this is going to be, they don't know what gender dimension is. They think this is a women's rights discussion. It's not. It's a gender issue. It's a changing perspectives, understanding the facts, the realities out there, and we're being blindsided on many of these aspects as men, and maybe some women as well. So I just think we have to be patient.
Thank you, Kurt. And yes, I think, you know, it's not so much about allies. It's in all genders' interest to push forward the gender equality agenda, right? But I think Ray was next, and sorry again to butt in, Jana.
Yeah, I was curious about one of the things that Renata was saying about people responding to what they think makes a good diplomat, and how they were mostly, you know, kind of normatively male characteristics and things like that. In interviews that I did about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the process there, so many diplomats were so they were so energized by the leadership of women in the process. And the president of the conference was a woman from Costa Rica, and she appointed a very diverse group to run to be friends of the chair and run small room meetings on different aspects of the treaty. And the responses to how those women leaders in that process engaged and treated people, it was so interesting. I mean, there's a lot of sort of gender normativity to unpack there as well, in terms of how they expected and appreciated women guiding these meetings. That's another conversation. But I think it's sort of interesting that in your work, Renata, you found that when they think about it abstractly, they want a man in the job, but then when they actually do it, they actually appreciated having the woman being the leader in the role. And so all of that, I think, needs a lot more investigation. I'm very curious about this. But in terms of practical things that we can look at, I think, you know, there's the sponsorship type of activities that I mentioned. I think the other lesson from the TPNW is who gets appointed to be friends of the chair and into these leadership roles is really important. Chair appointments are important. Now here I'm backsliding into, you know, very basic participation things, but just like Deepti is frustrated and exhausted by having the same conversations over and over again, we need to examine the fact that in the UN history, we have had one woman chair First Committee on Disarmament and International Security, just one. That's appalling. At the Non-Proliferation Treaty review conferences, we've had one woman preside over a review conference in the NPT's history. I mean, these are just appalling numbers. And if we can't even get that right at this time, as Deepti says, you know, all the rest of it that we're dreaming about here and talking about, and that we know is possible if people, if we can smash the patriarchy, just it makes it so much more difficult, I think. Creating space for the gendered norms and perspectives that we've talked about today, I think that's really important. You know, in a lot of different disarmament and arms control meetings, there's thematic debates about different issues or working groups that are set up on different issues. Having dedicated space to talk about this would be very, very important, and it would help, I think, affect government policy and get into outcome documents that will have recommendations for states to undertake, et cetera. And then for governments that are allies in this work to support the NGOs on this, to elevate different perspectives, to help bring survivors to meetings and to be engaged in the policy discussions. All of those things are very practical steps that can be undertaken.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ray. Chantal, do we have time for one? I have one last question I would like to pose to the panelists. Okay, so one of the questions that was brought forward by the audience, and I'm slightly paraphrasing it, is how, so this group we're speaking to right now, we're kind of on the same page. We all acknowledge that there's a large value in thinking about gender in multiple ways in the context of arms control and disarmament. Now, what do you do if you're speaking in context where people might be more hostile towards these approaches? Maybe each of you could share one trick or one argument you fall back on when you're speaking in a room where people, as Renata said in the beginning, basically the first thing they say is, why does this matter? Why should we care about this? I think that could be a nice way to round up the discussion, to just reflect upon what is the key argument we can bring forward for thinking about gender in the context of arms control and disarmament serious. I'm going to go with Deepti first, please, and then Renata and Ray. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share at least one last idea on this. For me, when there's the question about why does this matter, I look at it truly from a managerial and leadership perspective. And the way I frame it is that I have personally worked, and many of you do as well, on some of the toughest global challenges. Don't we deserve to have 100% of the talent pool addressing those challenges? How are we ever getting to where we want to be unless we have that? So that's what I use as the framing. And I think it's pretty difficult once it's framed that way for people to say it doesn't matter, because then they're saying talent doesn't matter, skills don't matter, leadership doesn't matter. And those perspectives don't matter. Whereas then I would say then their point of view on whether the mission matters is then in jeopardy. So that's one trick that I've used for many years now for trying to advance this agenda.
Fantastic, such a good trick. Thank you so much, Deepti. And Renata, what is your strongest pushback if people are critical?
I'm not sure if this is a pushback. As a researcher, I'm very interested also in people who don't see this as important, and I want to understand their context, and I want to understand why they think like that. So if someone is disregarding this topic, or it's not convinced, I ask them why is it that you don't think this is important? What do you see as a problem in this field? And what is the problem of bringing, working towards gender equality, of bringing gender into arms control and disarmament? And I think this is interest. I'm in the research business, so I think for me this is interesting. But I think it also is about creating connections with the person on the other side, and also understanding the different contexts in which people live and in which they work and operate. But yeah, so not too much of a trick, but using this as an opportunity to understand where is the resistance and what can we do to overcome that.
That is such a great point. Thank you so much, Renata, and a great way to start an inclusive conversation about gender themes that doesn't create a lot of tensions and frictions. Thank you. Ray, up to you now.
Yeah, I think one of the things I try to do is actually touch on a point that Ambassador Yeager mentioned, which is that gender is about everyone and affects everyone. Gender norms can harm us all, right? They can harm men as well in terms of limiting the possibilities of expression and experience that men are supposed to be able to have, and how that affects different people across an intersection of identities and oppressions. I think, we can also point out in the context of different issues how gender-based violence is also not just about women. Gender-based violence can affect men as well as any other group of people as well. And so an example of this is, say, drone strike targeting and casualty recording, where some government official policy is basically to count every male of a militant age as a militant, right? That's gender-based violence. That's grouping all men together and targeting them, or not just with drones, but in terms of military operations in general. But the drone strikes is where it's sort of come most clearly through. So I think the more examples we have of the ways that gender is really an issue that affects everybody, gender does not equal women, and gender is much more expansive than a binary notion. That is very useful for helping people to understand how it needs to be something that's taken into account by all of us at all policy levels.
Fantastic. Sorry, go for
Yeah,
it.
no, thank you very much. I would just like to add that, I think the relationship between the gender equality agenda on the one hand and peace and security on the other has been actually quite well established. And I think this relationship is also true when we're dealing with the arms control and disarmament field. But I also think you have to meet people at where they are at. Because if you start, throwing abstract concepts at them, you lose them right away. And lastly, I think that is why doing more research, collecting more data, coming up with innovative approaches to arms control and the objective of arms control and disarmament is really important. I think we're coming to the end, isn't not, Jana? So I would like to thank all our panelists, Deepti, Renata, Ray. I'd like to thank Ambassador Kurt Jäger for his support of this series, and to the audience. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I would say stay tuned, because this is a discussion that we will certainly have more of in the future. So with that, thanks to all of you, and we hope to see you soon at a next roundtable. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes.